All right, so we're on the third of these presentations I'm doing on Chapter 29, Revolutions and National States in the Atlantic World. This is on the influence of those revolutions, the American and French ones we've been talking about earlier. First, I'm going to talk about the other revolutions they inspire, and then the changes to the political thought processes. So, the uh, the only successful slave revolt in all of our history so far has been the revolution in Haiti, where they moved from being a French colony of Saint Domingue to an independent country of Haiti. So it is on the island of Hispaniola, so it's just in the Caribbean, uh, south of Florida, of course. On the east part of that colony is a Spanish colony that used to be called Santo Domingo, which today is called Dominican Republic. And on the French side, on the west, is Saint Domingue. So it was Saint Domingue was an incredibly rich Caribbean colony. It was great for sugar, coffee, and cotton, and it at the time was almost one third of France's total foreign trade. Now, society in Saint Domingue is going to have this same social makeup as a lot of these other colonies in Latin America. In 1790, we're going to have 40,000 white French settlers who are going to dominate the political and social structure of the colony. There's going to be 30,000 free people of color, of mixed race or freed slaves or so on and so forth, who are going to often have just like small plots of land. And then we're going to have 500,000 slaves of African descent. Again, a lot of the Native Americans, as we learned when Columbus landed on Hispaniola, a lot of them just escaped, disappeared, or died because of the labor or the diseases being brought by the Europeans. So they brought in African slaves. But working on these plantations is incredibly difficult and has a huge mortality rate. So many of them, uh, if there was just too much, they would find ways to flee into the mountains. And so we had all of these maroon populations that were living in the mountains, these African slaves trying to figure out how to live on these mountains away from the society. There's eventually going to be a revolt, and part of that is going to be inspired by the American and French revolutions, partially just on the Enlightenment thinking and rhetoric, but the other is going to be when 500 of these people of color is sent to fight British in the American War of Independence. They're going to realize that they are going to be able to stand up against these European powers. What's going to happen is that in 1789, the white settlers are going to see what the Americans what the Americans did to get freedom from the British. They say, "Hey, that's a great idea. Let's do that." So, kind of like in the American South, they want to have self rule, but they want to keep because they are equal to the rulers, but they don't want to share that equality with the colored people or obviously the slaves below them. So, as we've just talked about in the last slideshow, France is a bit busy, so civil war breaks out, 1791, and the slaves will revolt under a voodoo priest named Bookman. And what's going to happen is, especially since it's partially to try to keep the European power, and also because hey, it's a prosperous colony, the French, the British, Spanish forces, all of them will try to intervene at times to try to take over the colony. The real leader that rises up here is Toussaint, who renames himself Louverture, or the opening for his people, the opening of freedom in 1791. He's a descendant of slaves who was freed in 1776, which is a good year for freedom, and eventually is going to join rebel forces. He is going to build his own army of about 20,000 people, which will eventually dominate Saint Domingue. And in 1801, he's going to create a constitution based on equality, not just for the rulers, but for everyone. Um, by 1802, Napoleon has marshaled his forces in France, so they head on over, and they arrest him, and he dies in jail. However, by 1804, the Haitians are able to finally drive out the last of the French troops and declare their independence. Again, another case like in the American Revolutionary War, France is a bit busy, so they can't send their entire military over there. Now, this also these revolutions also are going to inspire Latin America. So we're going to look at Latin American society, and we're going to start with um, we're going to start taking a look at this. That when we look at Latin America at this point, our populations are pretty small. We're thinking that there was probably about 30,000 peninsulares in, from Mexico on down through um, Latin America, tip of South America. About 30,000 of those people are peninsulares, people from the peninsula of Iberia, either Spain or Portugal. There's going to be about 3.5 million Creoles, which are born in the Americas of Spanish or Portuguese descent. Now, this includes people who were, and so this includes, this is basically the children of different officials who have come over, or people who have come over to make money. Um, and even though by blood they're Spanish or Portuguese, just by being born in the Americas, they are seen as less than the peninsulares. So what ends up happening is that in 1810 to 1825, we're going to see a lot of movements which are going to be created for these Creoles to basically dominate, to create their own republic. So basically, kick out the peninsulares and the Spanish and Portuguese rulers, but they want to take the place of those rulers. And so again, we have about 30,000 peninsulares, 3.5 million Creoles, about 10 million others, African slaves and mixed race populations. What's going to end up happening is that um, as Napoleon, as we mentioned in the last slideshow, invades Spain and Portugal, that's going to weaken, again, the royal authorities, make them weaker for these colonies to gain their independence because, again, they're a bit busy. The priest Miguel de Hidalgo leads the revolt in Mexico, is captured and executed, but is still seen as a key force in the rebellion. Eventually, a Creole general, Augustine here, declares independence in 1821 and installs himself as emperor. Again, this whole idea of these Caucasians saying, "Hey, we're equal, but we're not going to share that equality with everyone else." So he's deposed in 1823, and a republic is established, which gives at least more Creoles and kind of opens the door more for more freedom. The southern regions of the Spanish colonies from what used to be Mexico are going to form their own federation. This is where kind of Central America really takes place. So we start to see real divisions for Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. And as we keep moving down south, we move into South America. And the key figure there is going to be a man named Simon Bolivar, who's going to lead the independence of South America from Spain. He's going to be a native of Caracas, which is in what we would call Venezuela today. And he's going to be heavily influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers, and he's going to try to pattern his life after George Washington. He helps to lead the rebellion against Spanish rule in 1811. Doesn't go great, so he is forced into hiding, but is still a key revolutionary figure, and eventually forms alliances with other Creole leaders in other areas like San Martin in Argentina and O'Higgins in Chile. So the Spanish rule is essentially these groups kind of working together against Spain, basically destroy the Spanish rule by 1825. But what is going to take its place? Bolivar, again, being very influenced by George Washington and the American colonies and the United States of America, wants to create like a U.S. style federation. So, which does make quite a bit of sense. Again, when the U.S. was formed, the states were very important. And so, it mattered whether you were from North Carolina or South Carolina. In many ways, and even more so, he tries to form kind of like these federation of states together with Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador to form what he calls Gran Colombia. Even attempts to get Peru and Bolivia in the mix. Unfortunately, the political differences are just too strong between these different groups, and so Gran Colombia disintegrates. So Bolivar decides to go and put himself into exile, where he unfortunately dies of tuberculosis. But having been a key figure in leading the independence of South America from Spain. Now, Brazil, on the other side there of South America, is obviously under control of Portugal, as we learned last semester. So Napoleon, again, as he's fighting Spain and fighting Portugal, the royal family decides to get the heck out of Dodge, or get the heck out of Portugal. They go to Rio de Janeiro, not a bad place to avoid a revolution. And in 1821, the king returns, but he leaves his son behind to act as regent, basically to run Brazil for him. Pedro, wanting to gain some power for himself, and realizing what is happening in other parts of South America, decides to negotiate with the Creoles and declares independence of Brazil. He sets himself up as the leader, as Emperor Pedro I, and the social structure is going to remain largely intact in Brazil for quite a while. It's one of the last places to get rid of slavery. So we take a look at Latin America in 1830, and this map should look relatively normal to us. We have the Rio Grande right here, which we would know as Texas today. But as you can see, 1821 and through quite a bit of the 1800s, all of this is going to be a part of Mexico, including where we live right now, which is around here. You can see the beginnings of Central America, those provinces which I mentioned before, those federations. And then we have Gran Colombia right here. Peru and Brazil decide to do their own thing. We have the Empire of Brazil here, and so on and so forth. So you see a lot of the countries we still see today in South America. It all started with Hispaniola, which I'll show you right here. So Hispaniola is right here. This box is this box right here. So as you can see, it's basically split in half. This eastern side is for Spain. The western side is Saint Domingue, run by France, later becoming Haiti. All right. So these revolutions in America and France influence other revolutions, but they also influence thought in general. So especially in England and also in America and in France, we start to see these new ideas within Enlightenment kind of be formed. And so these new ideas are either going to be kind of labeled as conservatism or liberalism. So conservatism is basically people who want change, but want it to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. That when they believe parts need to be changed, you just change the parts that need to be changed, and you do that slowly, and it just slowly evolves over time. Everything's very regimented. Now, liberalism, and like I think I mentioned, Edmund Burke in England would be an example of that. The other way you could think of is, hey, things are wrong, let's just change it. And that would be people who would be considered liberalism. And so these people believe, hey, if slow change is no change or is not good for people. So, what we should do is we should manage but not stifle social change. And John Stuart Mill would be a good example of this. So, what conservatives and liberals believe really is dependent on what time period we're talking about. But the part that stays the same then and now is this idea of change. And again, that's one of the things I think that we're having an issue with today is we think, well, if I'm conservative, I have to believe in blank, 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 blank. That's not what being conservative means historically. Being conservative historically means, hey, I believe that when change needs to happen, it should just happen slowly. We should be sure that we're doing the right thing, and we shouldn't be doing that slow. Liberals don't believe in necessarily blank, blank, or blank like our media sometimes tells us today. They're just people who are like, hey, if there needs to be change, we need to have massive change. And if that's what needs to happen, that's what needs to happen, and we need to do it now. The French Revolution is actually where we also get left and right associated with these things. Just like you and your families probably hang out with people who think like you, or if you think of in the days of yore when you used to be able to be in a school and you could eat lunch wherever you'd want, you would normally kind of eat lunch with people who kind of think like you, where you have a lot in common with. Same thing back then during the National Assembly. What would happen is for whatever reason, the conservatives would tend to be on the right side of the room. And the more conservative they thought, the more they tended to be on the right side, so they were away from the liberals. The liberals, for whatever reason, they tended to sit on the left side of the room. And again, the most extreme normally to the farthest left possible, so they didn't have to listen to the conservatives. And then we had the centrist in the middle. Okay, and we still use those terms. That's where we get left and right to this day. All right. When it comes to the another huge change is not only this idea and kind of this breaking up of Enlightenment thinking, but also is the slave trade, which we talked about earlier last semester. So again, the campaign to end slavery really is in the midst of this era. Equiano is one of the important leaders in the 1700s, and this idea gains momentum after the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. Once this idea of, hey, somebody, we're all just human, so we're all equal. You know, the only people who like that more than the Caucasians are any groups that have had a lot of things and a lot of history of not being treated equally. So we see this in the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. William Wilberforce in England is seen as a huge driving force for this in England. He figures out how to make it happen. And so Parliament outlaws the slave trade in 1807. But as we've talked about, um, other slaves would follow suit with saying, hey, we aren't going to sell them. But illegal trade really kind of continues in earnest until 1867. And my U.S. history buffs know, oh, that's about the time the Civil War ended. Yep, that's one of the things it coincides with. So once the United States says, yeah, not just the trade is illegal, but having slaves in general is illegal, that's one of the things that really just slows down the slave trade. So what ends up happening is, again, the most spectacular place that slavery ends is going to be in Haiti. Mexico is going to abolish slavery in 1829. Part of that is going to be done to help stop the U.S. The people in the U.S. who start kind of moving into what we would call Texas today. So farmers from the United States start moving into portions of Mexico and start setting up plantations that are obviously these plantations have a lot of slaves. And so partially to try to slow that encroachment, Mexico abolishes slavery. It doesn't quite work out. We'll talk about that later. The other thing, in 1833, Britain abolishes slavery again. So the slave trade is illegal in 1807, abolishes slavery in 33 all the way, although they do, unfortunately, in a bad part of history, they do have to pay, the government does pay the owners of slaves because, again, slaves are seen as property. So, yeah, evil, rich people are going to be evil. Other states as well will follow. But again, throughout this, what's really crucial to understand is even though on paper, um, people are going to be given freedom, especially African Americans, they aren't going to be given equality, which is obviously incredibly important. So again, you're going to be a slave, you're going to be free, but then really where are you going to work? And so a lot of them are going to kind of move back into basically being slaves again as sharecroppers. Sure, you're free. Someone doesn't own you, but are you allowed to own property? Sure, you're free, but should you really be given the ability to vote? And so we're going to have all sorts of things that we're going to have, and all of these things build into what we call systematic racism. Is that sure, on paper you're free, but you have all of these systems in place which make it tougher for you. There's all these systems in place that make it more difficult for you. And this systematic racism isn't new. It's been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so then again, if you're having trouble in this life, your children or your children's children are going to have issues as well. That's another way that systematic racism rears its head, is making things difficult for descendants as well. Another group, which is really tries to take the Enlightenment reins to try to create rights for themselves, is women as well, which is obviously good. So what happens is that Enlightenment, again, this whole idea of all men are created equal, is really just in their minds really for men and often for white men. The men stayed very patriarchal by and large. And even when they were like giving, wanting women to have a little bit more independence, we have people like Rousseau who said, yeah, of course women should have an education, because who's going to train our sons to be good sons? So yeah, sure, they should be educated. So, they can be interesting for their husbands to talk to. Still very much sure they should have freedom, but not really. They should just be educated so that they make men's life run easier. A couple of women who make very good and solid cases for women to have equality are Mary Astle in England, who argues that women essentially are born into slavery. They're born under the slavery of their master, of their first father, or their first daddy, and then once they get married, they get a new daddy who is their who is their husband, who also basically greatly controls their life. We'll talk much more about this in the next era as well. That this is an ongoing battle, and some of the issues that women still have to this day. Another woman that's very important is Mary Wollstonecraft, who writes a vindication of the rights of women, who writes very persuasively about how women need to have equality. They need to have their rights written as well as men. Um, so one of the things that's going to happen is that one of the ways that women are going to be able to get their rights to vote is going to be how important they're going to be actually to the revolution. In France, women play a key role. There is going to be a riot that starts when women are going to storm the palace at Versailles in '89 to demand food for them and their children. Women are going to be some of the literal foot soldiers for the revolution, sometimes patrolling the streets with firearms. We're going to have women patrols. And yet they're going to have very few of them are going to have any real strong positions of authority. Um, some of the things that do start to happen is they do start to gain equality in terms of being allowed to go to school. Again, much lower levels normally than men, but being more accepting of them going to school. The concept of them being able to own property, and especially in cases of like widows or widows if they don't have a husband. And another thing, which is huge, is the legalization of divorce in a lot of in a lot of the Atlantic world. And again, we'll talk more about that in the next era. The thing that eludes them for a longer time, as they're starting to get rights, thankfully, we're starting to get, when it comes to voting, that's going to be a big task of the 1800s. So again, in the U.S., one of the big suffragettes is going to be Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is going to be important. And again, this is something that comes very late. And just to kind of, again, it's good that these things have been changes, but we got to be careful about idolizing the people in the past. One of the very effective arguments during the 1800s, after the Civil War, was women demanding to their husbands, "Hey, if you're saying African Americans, these former slaves, should be treated equally, how why am I not treated? Aren't I better than these former slaves?" And again, that's a horrible, so fraught line of reasoning, the way that they were using it. And the reason I bring it up is just again to help us remember that this change we're not in the glory years here. There's still a lot of racism and patriarchy we're fighting at this point, and also just to show how strong the systematic racism is against African Americans at this point. That that the women were using that some women were using that example to try to demand their own rights to vote, and so on and so forth. And with that, that is section number 3.